Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, you guys, to CastCast. I am your host, Casty Streeter, and today we look back at Super Wild Card Weekend and what a wild weekend it was. Um, I'm not gonna lie, a couple of surprises this weekend, but maybe not so many surprises. Um, Looking at the first game we had being Cleveland and Houston. Everyone thought going into this game it was going to be a real test of CJ Stroud's ability. Don't get me wrong, I think he played very, very well. But the one thing that I'll say about this team, and that I've kind of thought the whole season, is that they have a very, very good offensive line. And if you look at how much CJ Stroud got sacked this year, it wasn't really all too much. Yes, he got sacked and had a concussion protocol, but I think that was his only sack he took that game, if I remember correctly. And their O line has been doing a wondrous job, which alleviates some pressure on him. Don't get me wrong, I think I've seen plenty of plays where he extends, where he shows that he can get out of the pocket, make throws downfield, strong arm, still always looks to pass, even though he's pretty athletic. And I mean, I could go on and on about CJ Stroud because obviously, what a fantastic year that is still going. Looking at Flacco, I wouldn't really say that this game was on him. Yes, he threw a couple picks. He was sacked 4 times with 39 pressures. But to me, the whole thing that's won this game is the fact that you have a pretty good rushing attack. Not elite by any means on Houston's, but you have a pretty good rushing attack. And, for the most part, the Texans have been a throwing team where Singletary has kind of emerged as like the guy for them later in the year. I all think that we would have thought Damian Pierce would have taken a step up after what he did last year on obviously a very bad team. I'm sure we remember last year that, Damian Pierce doing wonders. And it's kind of bizarre this year that, yeah, they have Singletary, who obviously came from the Bills, kind of still he has something to prove. And I think he knows that it's like this window for the Texans could be open for a while because of how good CJ Stroud is. And the rushing attack of Cleveland, just abysmal. 56 total yards on 20 attempts. So a terrible 2.8 average, where the highest average was on Joe Flacco, 3 for 13 yards. Where clearly they're not going to design runs for Flacco. But, I feel bad for Cleveland because this seemed like a year where they could kind of change their fate. And I think they did change it in a sense. I think that Cleveland, what they did this year kind of proves that they can fix a couple of things and they could be contenders next year. If I were Cleveland, even though, there's many people that say this isn't ever a good idea, I would keep Flacco or sign him, keep him as like the backup or something like that to light a fire under Deshaun Watson. Because with what they traded for him, with what they're paying him, you really want him to start and produce, of course. And obviously with him, if he's able to play the way he was on the Texans, even to like 80% of that, I'm sure he could easily replicate what obviously an older player like Flacco did, and hopefully he learned some things while he was kind of sitting on the bench. Sometimes that mental reset where you don't have to have the stress of playing, you don't want to kind of improve your game, you don't want to, or it's too much pressure, to really change up what you do. Maybe that's the reset that he needs. And I'm not like a Deshaun Watson hater, but I don't particularly like him after this year, as I'm sure the majority of people don't like him. And I mean, a lot of people, it goes back to his, legal issues. But I think this is a guy that, he could be good for, I guess I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember his age, but he could be good for another like 10 years potentially, if he gets back on track. And with, Njoku finally kind of emerging and being kind of that piece that like they can use, that big body target tight end, that has pretty good speed as well. And then you also have Amari Cooper, who's, I think his play style ages really well, where it's like this dude's not a blazer, but a consistent route runner, strong hands, able to do great things. But it's like these are pieces that I think are, incredibly desirable. Excuse me. And it's exciting. I think it's an exciting prospect to be the QB of the Browns with how they turned it around. And obviously, I think that even with this loss, and I mean, I guess I haven't really paid much attention to the Browns, but I'm sure that they will keep Stefanski. Even though I'm not a huge fan of Stefanski, I thought they should have gotten rid of him a couple of years ago when nothing was going their way. But he did a good job this year. And that's without Nick Chubb. We forget that this is a team that, like, oh yeah, Nick Chubb's injured. Yes, it was early on, so maybe, they had a long season without him and they had some self-discovery of who the other leaders can be. But if this team has a healthy Nick Chubb, Njoku, and Cooper, sky's the limit. And maybe that is one reason why their run game kind of suffered, is because it's hard to really go from having the best running back in football. I'll say it. I think that Chubb is the best because he is a pure running back where he's not going to do much receiving. And I think that, like, saying that running backs have to be able to catch, yes, it's like a plus on their resume, but I don't think that makes them a better running back, because that's not what the position is. They're essentially a wide receiver when they're going out, unless it's out of the backfield, because obviously that's been a thing for running backs for a long time. But yeah, the Browns, kudos to them. It was sad, what happened, but they did meet with a Houston team who clearly, pretty young team, and, are hungry. And the Texans, much like my Packers, very young, very promising QB, just look like they're poised to at least go out swinging. And this game, their team mixed with, they have some good veterans. Desmond King II, I think, is still a very good veteran. Obviously, you have, Derek Stingley Jr. as well, who I think just has had such a storied career. And then his dad, knowing Madden, I mean, he's just kind of grown up in the culture of, around great people and that involved in the sport. But, I think that this is a team that you can't really go against, with playmakers around the board. But yeah, congratulations, Houston. I'm really hopeful you're able to at least look good, next week. But that I shouldn't even be hopeful at this point. I think that you guys are gonna be playing well and, putting the pressure on whatever team you're playing because you aren't just a free win like some people thought going into Super Wildcard weekend. Because, many people thought that, yeah, this is a free game for the Browns. There's no way that they lose to the Texans, much like some other games this weekend. With that monologue, if you guys don't have anything to share or, voice about the game, obviously, if we watch, if you're a football fan, you more than likely watched all the games, maybe besides yesterday, because even though it was a holiday, it's a Monday and people probably still work. But if nothing wants to be said, then I'll be moving on to Chiefs Dolphins. Another game where, goodness, the fourth coldest game in NFL history. And, there were people that said the game should have been canceled. Obviously, like, the hazard of that kind of weather, and that sort of thing. The thing is with Kansas City is it's windy as hell always, almost always there. And, looking to this game, I was kind of amazed that they did play it, to be honest. But maybe the league, felt the pressure that, like, we can't be delaying all these games. Maybe they could have pushed it to Sunday, but I don't think it would have been that much different. It's been it was a cold weekend in the States. I know that even here in Colorado, it was like negatives. It was negatives most of the weekend. We were sitting in hibernation because can't take the dog out. When it's cold, too cold for like, a part husky where she's like, lifting her foot off the ground because she's like, damn, it's too cold. It's too cold. But yeah, looking at Miami, goodness gracious, they were cold. The thing is about the Tyreek touchdown is that Tyreek, yeah, he made some guys miss and he kind of jogged in. But then maybe Kansas City took that personally. They're like, oh man, you don't play here anymore. That was maybe a courtesy touchdown because after that, goodness. And I get that it's like, it's one of these anomaly games where it's like, I do think that this sort of thing affects, the outcome of the game, how you're going to be able to play. Because obviously, even looking at this, it's like you have Raheem Mostert, playing, who it's like he had been doing well, and even Devon Akane had been doing well. And it's like they, Mostert averaged 4.1 a carry, but he only had 8 carries. And then Tua, it's like, had the highest average with 3 carries for 25 yards. Where, most of his runs were, net gain positive. And it's like Tua doesn't run. And most of the games I've seen this year, Tua is one of those that he gets rid of it quick. He is a throw mentality. It also kind of helps that he has, obviously, some of the quickest guys in the NFL. And, not that he's going to be passing to Mostert, but then he also has Waddle and Tyreek, obviously. But the Chiefs, they put their foot down. They put their foot down against this team. It's crazy to me that, like, Mahomes threw it 41 times. This game, if anything, really did help Kansas City because they're like, if we can have a pretty good passing game in these kind of conditions, it's like, it's going to feel like a breeze the rest of the playoffs. And obviously going into next week, I'm pretty sure it's Kansas City, Houston, right? So that'll be a battle of, I'll say it, 2 great quarterbacks where one, he's got to kind of prove it after the first year, but Stroud is well on his way. But yeah, Mahomes playing pretty well. Didn't get sacked once. Tua only got sacked twice, don't get me wrong, but Pacheco pounding it and pounding it and pounding it. And it's like, dude, that Dolphin defense must have been miserable. Their offense doing seemingly nothing. Rashee Rice, obviously he's one of those guys where it's like you don't have to pass that far off the line of scrimmage. They usually just set up screens and, route or lanes for Rashee Rice to run with his burst. And it's like you can play to some hard nose, quick pass and pound it after the after the catch yard. Sorry. But a good game. Good game for them. Kelsey had a bit of a quieter game than I would have thought. He did have 10 targets, but 7 catches for 71. I'll take it in this kind of game. It was fine. It was fine. And it's like Edwards-Helaire with a fumble. It's probably hard to hold on to an ice cold football, to be honest with you. I'm surprised. I mean, there was obviously 3 fumbles on Kansas City. And, Deshaun Hand came up with 1. They only lost 1, but who knows if those kind of things, were to go the other way, maybe it's a different game. But yeah, Kansas City ultimately showing that, yeah, we're going to be a team in the postseason that our defense is, and don't get me wrong, this was a defensive game, and the defense of Kansas City hasn't been what's been suspect for them this year. But welcome to Kansas City playoff football, people, is all I can say. As much as I would like for someone else to maybe make the Super Bowl and, win the championship game, or have a little bit more variety, in the postseason, which, don't get me wrong, we still have some variety. Houston, Buffalo somewhat, I guess, but, and then obviously like the Ravens being in it this year is a little bit different, but yeah, this looks like a fun off season. Or I guess no, it isn't Texans Chiefs. It's Chiefs Ravens. Wait a minute. Or wait, no, it's Texans Baltimore. Okay. Yeah, I totally got my games mixed up for what next weekend in the seeding. But moving on, we have probably the most kind of insane game of the weekend, that being my Packers against the Cowboys. I said that I thought the Cowboys would win this game. I legitimately believed that with the way that they had been playing, and that they do have a pretty good pass rush, but the fact that they didn't get to Love like at all. Don't get me wrong, there were some times that, I remember when, Love had scrambled to his right, the guy then came back to try and catch up to him, and then he shimmies to his left, and then he throws downfield for a big gain. He had a really incredible pocket presence and awareness, which is something that is insanely hard to teach. I feel like you sometimes, even with Aaron Rodgers, there was sometimes that I'd be like, man, he doesn't notice that the pocket is collapsing this way or that way, even though we know him for so many great passes. But Love, good Lord. I don't just want to brag about him, though. I want to brag about Zach Tom. I have said it to people all year. And there were people that were like, on Twitter, of course, that they're like, oh man, Zach Tom holding up against Micah Parsons. And it's kind of crazy, but like, it's kind of crazy to me. But even, Skip Bayless, who I watched a short tidbit of him, of course, he was destroyed because he's a Cowboys fan. He's like, this is the worst loss we've ever seen, and it's kind of funny because the Packers have owned the Cowboys in the playoffs since that stadium has been built. The Packers are undefeated when visiting the Cowboys Stadium. I think it's AT&T Stadium, which you'd think would be hard to believe, right? But there's just something about, I think it's more so on the Cowboys that the teams they've had and the coaching they've had have been not this cutthroat, no mercy kind of thing, but a lot of, there's a lot of speculation that the reason why the Cowboys can never have this top tier elite culture is because Jerry Jones won't hire a coach that is essentially going to be the identity of the team. A coach that's going to be like Kyle Shanahan, Bill Belichick, another guy, I guess, John Harbaugh, these elite coaches that are always in contention, always improving, And living in Colorado, I've talked to some people that are Cowboys fans, and they're like, yeah, we're a fan, but we don't really expect anything to happen. And once your fans get into that mentality, it's just, it is not a good, mentality to have. And I honestly, I kind of understand a little bit of what the Cowboys' issue is. Yes, they have these talented players and they've had these good offensives. And don't get me wrong, CD Lamb, hell of a player. He went out to prove this year that he is one of the top 5 wide receivers in the league. And I would, looking at the rest of the league, I would maybe be willing to argue at least that is potentially true. And it's crazy to me. He's obviously got a 5th-year option next year, but if I was him, I wouldn't be going after the bag with Dallas. I would be holding out on them. And if they do a franchise tag, tell them you're not going to play for them, because if you want to, unless your only focus is money, if your focus is money, Dallas is the place, because you look at Zeke, how much he got paid from them, and then they had to get rid of him because of how ridiculous his contract was, and he just wasn't worth the money, clearly. But yeah, you look at this team and it's like great pieces, is good enough to always make the playoffs, but they can't get gritty when the going gets tough for them. I've actually never really liked Dak Prescott either. I thought it was asinine when Jerry Jones said, "Oh, Dak Prescott is a Super Bowl winning quarterback." Don't get me wrong, I think that Dak does fine for the most part, but there are some things that he does that it's like, the interception to Jair Alexander, that looked to me, I mean, it didn't look like necessarily a bad throw, but poor accuracy, where it's like, it's, if you're putting that in front of the wide receiver, at the worst, it's an incomplete. And then the other thing about it is I don't like his temperament. When there was that 1 3rd down where he threw to CD and it was out of CD's reach, and CD is a 6'3". I don't know what his arm length is, but you can tell that he has long arms and big hands. He is he's a chiseled down guy, but he is big, and he can he can body out these cornerbacks. Like, there's not really going to be any cornerbacks that are really going to be able to like overpower him more often than not in one-on-one coverage. So if you're able, I mean, it was kind of a tough throw, but it was bad. And then he looked at CD as if CD did something incredibly wrong afterwards. And I'm just like, dude, you getting tilted out of shape. Like, at that point, you kind of already know that it is not good for Dallas. And they say it was like 40 million that were watching the game. And they definitely were all at watching at that point. Like, that was still early in the game. But to me, you need a quarterback that isn't going to try and put the blame on his teammates. And I feel bad for CD, because they even said, like, oh, this guy's not a diva. He's not that kind of guy. He's not a self-absorbed dude, And you could kind of tell by his body language that it's like, man, dude, I'm sorry that you have to be on this sideline. Yes, I'm taking the side of CD because I think he's too talented. He's kind of in the same situation that like Jefferson is in, where, I mean, Kirk this year, I'll say, was playing better than Dak ever was, this year at any point in the year. I will say that, because I think Kirk Cousins actually, it's not that he was necessarily playing better, like, yardage-wise and throw-wise, but he was committing less turnovers, which I think is kind of the doom and gloom of these guys, that they have these high numbers, but they're not the reason you win, but they're able to put the ball in play to give your guys a shot at it, And I mean, I've said it for years. I think that Dak and Kirk, they're great fantasy QBs because during the regular season they're great. They're gonna put up the yards, but postseason is just a different animal, and they can't handle it. But that's enough about the Cowboys. And I mean, you know, like I was saying, Skip Bayless openly said he's like, oh, Micah Parsons, he sucks. He is overrated. Maybe it was a little bit of sarcasm or just a little bit of backlash to kind of light a fire under just the Cowboys in general. And it's crazy to me. Jerry Jones was so flabbergasted, a guy who usually never shies away from what he's going to say, shied away because it was that, harsh of a defeat for his, essentially his team. And yeah, there's people that are like, Jerry Jones needs to turn he can be the owner, but he needs to not be this insane micromanager. And the dude is 81. It's it's insane. But my Packers, what I will say about this team is that we are showing up, and it doesn't matter who is your star guy, whether it be Jaden Reed, who is obviously our leading wide receiver, who didn't even have 800 receiving yards. Yes, he had over 800 because he had plenty of like rushing yards and even some rushing touchdowns. And he had overall, it's like if Jaden Reed were to do what he did this year every single year, maybe he wouldn't be the leading wide receiver, every single year because, I don't think it's a winning formula. I mean, no, dash what I just said. I'm not going to say it's not a winning formula because I think the one thing that's dangerous about my Packers is that, and I mean, I'm trying to remember who said it, but I agree with wholeheartedly that the difficulty with the Packers right now is that we don't have a number one. The thing I'll say about this game is that people were like, well, Watson was back. He was obviously kind of on a snap count where they were like, I would say babying him, but no, they were. I don't want to say that because that sounds demeaning to it. I think that they were intelligently knowing that it wasn't win or lose if Watson was on the field. But Watson, after what he did, last year against the Cowboys in that freak show of a game, they had guys and it was like triple coverage on him, which freed up a lot of the other wide receivers. Don't get me wrong, it looked like there was plenty of blown coverages where these guys, it's like, goodness gracious, you like look like you're playing, catch in the off season where you're practicing routes and you're throwing deep balls, that are essentially free with no defenders. But whether it's Wicks, Dobbs, obviously on Sunday, which is funny to me because I even saw someone posting like, oh, here's this dude Dobbs with a chest injury who's coughing up blood in the locker room who had to go to the hospital, but then came back because they're like, oh, he'll be fine. And he just comes and he puts up his best game of the season. And I'm just like, man, dude, off-season Dobbs, I could get used to this. But it's like, and then it's like you don't even see Jaden Reed, the leading wide receiver of the Packers. And obviously, like, teams probably don't, the other, kind of obscure advantage that we have is that teams don't know what our offense is going to look like when Watson's on the field because of how limited. Like, I'm sure the amount of snaps that Watson has had this year is probably less than like 100 on offense with how injured he's been. But even when he comes back, and it's like Jair and Watson, we're both lobbying LaFleur to be like, let us play. And they both had an impact. Obviously, Jair, you see a little bit more of an impact with him picking off Dak Prescott. But yeah, Watson, it's crazy because people don't want to get torched against like what is like what a would be Randy Moss kind of in this day and age, being that Watson is 6'4". I don't think quite as fast and freakish as Moss, but who cares? He's too tall. You can't. It's so easy to like throw it deep to him, and especially with Love having developed his deep throw, where I think that was one of their problems earlier in the year is that when he threw it deep, it was so off that it's like, oh, nobody can catch this. So there's not even, I mean, some of them, there weren't even a chance for a pick. And then it's like, oh yeah, if this guy can't throw deep, we can just play everyone up on the line. We don't have to worry about who's running behind us. But now he's got a crazy accurate deep ball that, sometimes it looks like he just slings it up, but he's still putting it in a spot where, oh, his receiver can at least fight for it or go for it. And I don't really want to bring too much attention, I guess, to the Packer defense, even though I think they played really well, but we didn't force an insane amount of pressure on Dak Prescott. Yes, it says here he got sacked 4 times, but goodness gracious, did he have a lot of time. So it's not even that. I'd like to say that I think that, obviously the Cowboys, I think that their O-line is their most special part of their team. Yes, I said that, even though they had all the pressures, all the sacks on defense, but that O-line has been good for so many years. But you're kind of wasting their talent not being able to run it and only really throwing it. So, I also wanted to give a shout out, of course, to Aaron Jones. I had said that one of the formulas for success with the Packers was that they would need to lean on the run. And I think that the run really did help set up the pass. And Aaron Jones is just a guy that he plays with so much good energy. All he is good vibes. He's such a good guy, always smiling, And it isn't this that he's a cocky dude and he's not expecting to get paid later, because he's obviously been more than willing to take pay cuts to stay with the Packers. And he's just such a lovable player. I mean, it's hard for me to think of a team without Aaron Jones at this point. Because without him, yes, I think that Love would be making some throws and he may have a bit more passing yards, but I don't think you would have the same sort of dynamic where you are putting a lot of pressure on the other team's offense because you can execute on more than just passing. And don't get me wrong, there were some times early that the Cowboys, they were really stacking the box and they were like, we're not going to let you run. But eventually, it kind of broke down that it's like, we can't play like this if we're going to defend the pass. And I think that was the ultimate Achilles heel of the Cowboys, is that their run defense, they had to commit way too much to actually be good at it. And I was saying it all year. It was the potential downfall of their team. But kudos to my Packers. Obviously, I'm very happy. And it's one of those things that it's like, at this point, I do want to say that I think we have a good shot against the Niners. I think the Niners are a great team. Obviously, they'll be well rested, and I think that they'll put up a better game defensively, because they're not pushovers against the run. They play, a good physical defense. And they also have a better, obviously, linebacker than Dallas has in Fred Warner. And I mean, that's not really a discredit to Dallas, but Fred Warner's accolades speak for themselves, as he is arguably the best in the league. But looking at, looking at my Packers, I think these are guys that they're kind of playing to prove who they are as a players, and everyone is hardworking and is contributing. And it seems like a dream come true that you have so many guys that are buying into this team, this brotherly culture that they've formed on this young, and they're like, we're going to stick together. there's nothing that's going to tear us apart. And it all comes down to how many times I saw these guys like, oh, a guy caught it, he's running downfield, but there's still a wide receiver that's like blocking. Like even a small guy like Jaden Reed is blocking, and he's, putting his damnedest best block on these, defensive backs. And it's like teams don't want to have to play like this, where it's like, oh, we're not just going to gouge you and make you feel defeated. We are going to make you earn or take it physically, which is a side that I haven't seen in the Packers for a long time offensively. A lot of it has been finesse. Rodgers, Adams being the prime example. Don't get me wrong, I think that Adams is a tough cookie, but the offense looks so much different. I mean, a little bit different than it has in years, and I think it's a testament to how LaFleur has coached them, and he never gave up on this team. And he's got that fire in him. So it's like, people are obviously, I'm preaching to like the choir when everyone's saying that, oh, the Packers are a team nobody wants to play. And I think that is coming more true to fruition now than any other point in the season. I've kind of ranted about this enough. You guys, I mean, if anyone's listening, you guys know that I'm a huge Packers fan and I love it. But moving on to Lions and the Rams, you guys are probably going to be like, oh, you're just a Lions hater. But in all honesty, in my opinion, when my sister and I are watching this game, the fact that Puka Nacua, who had a historic NFL season, one that we could have never predicted, and nobody predicted, he was like the highest waiver wire target, for fantasy this year of like some insane 90% like pickup rate or whatever else. And it's like, don't get me wrong, I think the Rams were kind of poised for a bounce back season because their O-line was a lot more healthy this year, where it's like, I remember at one point last season where I was like, oh yeah, they've had 20 different combinations or something. And I was like, no freaking wonder Stafford can't be comfortable back here. Don't get me wrong, Stafford's a smart QB, and he does a very good job, honestly, for having the speed of like an old man. Because he's not a scrambler. And it's not like he can't make passes out of the pocket. We've clearly seen it. His sidearm, his technique, his arm, he's really underrated. And don't get me wrong, he's had interception problems in the past, but I think that he's one of those QBs that it's like he has such good arm technique, and sometimes I think that he does make some hasty decisions because he's a proud quarterback, and that's not taken away from him, but sometimes that can get your ego in the way of, intelligent decisions. But I think that the Rams were robbed. And obviously, I'm talking about the hold that they showed where the guy tugged on Puka's jersey. And you could say, oh, well, it wasn't catchable anyways. But this is Puka Nacua, who has been going up, played, through some, tough injuries this year, like a rib injury and some other stuff. But he proved that he belongs. And I wouldn't quite say he's a top 5 wide receiver, because I do remember that it was so many games before his first touchdown. And I think that that's an important facet for any elite wide receivers, that you can have a lot of yards, but if you are not proving that you can be a reliable red zone threat, that's kind of to be desired, especially in today's league. But Detroit, this was their game to lose. And I said this, I thought it was definitely going to be higher scoring. And it definitely could have been if Goff hadn't had like a stutter where he wasn't doing very much in the second half. They didn't score that much in the second half. I mean, the Lions kind of owe it to their defense, but they don't, because I mean, there was the potential that, oh yeah, field goal was going to win the game for us. But looking at this game, I think the Rams are going to be a team that are going to be good again next year. I think that their defense, wasn't going to allow them to get past. You could say this game, but holding the Lions to 24 is, I mean, that's acceptable to me when they have had such a just a crazy offense where it's like, man, they manipulate the game with so many of these drop routes. They really make you play tight, and these guys, are good after the catch. And you got Goff, who doesn't really. I mean, he's had some games where he's turned it over, but in games like this, like even he didn't even turn it over in this game, and I think that was the difference of really what the offense what decided it, at least for the offense, is that even though they didn't do much offensively, they still protected the ball, which is important, especially in the playoffs. But yeah, the Rams, I feel like they kind of got robbed. And it's like, everybody saw it when they showed the replay that clearly this guy had his hand on his jersey, and tugged on it. And it's like, how don't you see that? The guy who is on their matchup. But otherwise, pretty good game. It almost seems like karma in the sense that the Lions were robbed by a bad call against the Cowboys. And if that had happened, obviously it would have been completely different. The Lions would have been playing the Packers, which, I mean, to be honest with you, with the way my Packers played, the Lions probably wouldn't have wanted to play us if they had played like this. Because I think the Rams defense, it is really lacking star talent. They only have like two guys still remaining from the Super Bowl win years ago, and that's Donald, and I can't even remember the other guy because they've had to change so many pieces. Because they did give up a lot of draft capital, and a lot of those guys, it's like, oh, we're not going to be able to pay all these dudes. They're going to get work elsewhere. But overall, kind of a game that's like, oh yeah, it leaves to be desired, I feel like. It was kind of sloppy on both sides. Yeah, the Lions looked like they were going to run away with it. And then I'm like, oh man, the Rams, they're really showing their gutsy. Yes, they only had 6 points in the second half. But, it kind of all started, in the second when they scored 14, and, it was 17-21. But, props to the Lions. I'm sure that they're going to be able to correct some things, but they did pretty well against an offense that, was pretty hot. Moving on to Bills Steelers, another game of crazy snow that obviously got delayed, as we all know. People were joking and they said that they should have still played this game. And it's like, I don't think you realize just how much snow there was, just the danger it would have been for, people as fans and players, sitting in the stands and whatever else. But still cold, but I was kind of surprised at the lack of snow. Like, they got rid of a lot of it, but with the way that it was and the way that there was snow or whatever else, it's like fans were tossing snow up after the Buffalo touchdowns, which there was, quite a few. The Buffalo really put the foot on the pedal in the first quarter, and then they still, kept consistent through the rest of the three, matching exactly what was scored by Pittsburgh, which is interesting. This could have been a completely different game in my eyes, where it's like, I feel bad for Pittsburgh. You guys obviously, were a 7th seed, and as we all know, no 7th seed had won before the day before with the Packers against the Cowboys. But clearly the Bills, a lot tougher. And I knew that it was going to be kind of an uphill battle for Pittsburgh. And I still think that they played moderately well, but I just didn't expect them to not run it better in this kind of a game. You have, Mason Rudolph, yes, with a pick, throwing 22 of 39 for 229. I think that's in the conditions that they were in. I think that that's, a modest day's work, to be honest with you, for him. I don't think you can say that, like, oh, Rudolph's the reason they lost this game. But they did not have any sort of run game to speak of. Yeah, you had Warren with a 4.8 yard average, But you take away his lawn of 12, and this is a guy who had seven carries for 26 yards, which is not terrible, but not ideal. And then even Najee Harris, who had been their bell cow, not much of a run game. And yeah, you've got James Cook, who had a good day, not a ton of yards, but it's like these gritty games and these gritty yards against a decent defense like the Steelers. Like, in my opinion, yes, you didn't have Watt, but I think that Watt's where he shines, obviously, is against the pass. Don't get me wrong, he's a good run defender, but I don't think that your Pittsburgh defense was really hurting too much against the run by losing Watt. I think that they have a good scheme, good coaching, and they're never going to be one of these teams that is absolutely like blown out. Yes, they gave up 31, but you're playing up against a good Josh Allen. And it's like quite crazy to me as well that he had a 52-yard run. It was absolutely fucking mind-boggling in a sense. But I think a good game by Buffalo. I think we know who they are, obviously. And I think that they have a really strong case going into next week that they can be a team that's extremely dangerous. And I think that Josh Allen is ready to put it behind him, that he's not going to throw interceptions. And he was, I mean, obviously, I wouldn't say he got a pass because they didn't have Watt, but obviously the Steelers having only they're like 1-11 without Watt or whatever it was in like the last 2 or 3 years or whatever it is. So it's obviously, it just shows how exemplary of a player that he is. So, good win by Buffalo. We'll see how they do next week. And I think it's, I think the AFC, it looks really fun. Who's left in the AFC? 4 of what could be arguably some of the best QBs in the league. But moving on to Buccaneers Eagles, I don't think there's really much to say about this game. I think that the Eagles, and nobody's going to be able to put their thumb on what happened, but I think this is a team that just didn't adjust to the coaching adjustments during the season. And it's kind of bizarre to me. Jalen Hurts looks like he was trying to compete, trying to bring life to this team. He is a guy who sometimes, he does look very questionable, but he's a competitor. He doesn't quit. And 25 of 35 for 250 with 1 TD. Yes, it's a little desirable in the the TD department, but you also had DeAndre Swift, who had a terrible day. So the passing game was really the only thing that they had. And, he did it without A.J. Brown. I'll say that. A.J. Brown not playing, which is a huge blow. He was having he was the guy that I thought if he kept on playing the way he did, he was the only one who could have maybe been second only to Tyreek this year. Second only to Tyreek because of the crazy year Tyreek had. And Devontae Smith having a huge game, clearly, balling out, trying to carry this team. But you really, not much else from the rest of their wide receivers. And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, knowing full well the situation of the Eagles, I think, and they were like, we're going to take advantage and we're going to win this game. Because even going into the postseason, I did say that I thought the Eagles were the weakest because of the way that they ended their season. And clearly that wasn't, something that, people could say, well, you were pulling that out of your butt. Like, you're not, there's no way you knew that the Eagles weren't going to turn it around or reset, come postseason. They clearly didn't reset. They may have even regressed offensively because they were still putting up points. Like when they lost to the Cardinals, I mean, they still put up points, guys. Yeah, it's against the Cardinals. And the Buccaneers, I wouldn't say that they have a terrible defense, but I don't think it's what it once was when they won a Super Bowl, of course. And I mean, they still have good pieces, but they're not a crazy defense that scares you, But yeah, looking at this game, Rashad White did well. You had Cade Oden as your leading wide receiver, which I think is nuts when you have guys like Evans and Godwin who didn't even go for over 100 yards combined, Don't get me wrong, they still had like some insane catches this game. But overall, this is a Buccaneers team that took advantage of the most struggling team in the NFL this year. I will say that. I don't even think that you can say that a team that did worse, such as like New England or the Panthers, you could say, struggled. Like they just don't have the talent to compete. But with the guys that the Eagles have, you full well think that they're gonna at least be able to compete. At least a good level, but they weren't even good at the end of the year. And I really feel sorry for them. Their fall from grace, and obviously it didn't happen right after. It obviously didn't happen at like the beginning of the season, even though they there were some games that I was like a little suspect of that it's like, oh, this is close. Oh, this doesn't look like you're completely dominant or anything like that, and your defense isn't what it was last year, even though you really didn't lose anybody. They didn't really lose enough for it to justify how bad their defense was throughout the year, and it caught up with their offense. I think their offense was kind of under development, and their offense was just skitty, and it never seemed to click. Which, in the league, if you're not clicking or you don't have, someone that is going to be the anomaly on your team, such as like a Jefferson, don't get me wrong, I think Brown, was that at the beginning of the year, but as soon as he kind of fell off and he wasn't doing as well at the end of the year, this team struggled. And I like Devontae Smith, but he needs to get a little bit more consistent, I feel like. He has these big games. Reminds me of kind of like a Tyler Lockett, where it's like, oh, this guy can get deep, he can go up, catch balls. He's tiny as hell, but he'll go up and he'll catch anything over these guys. But it's like it's a little inconsistent for me to like. And don't get me wrong, if they had other guys that were super consistent, then I wouldn't mind it. But to be honest with you, they have 3 guys on this team. They have Goddard, their tight end, who was injured a good amount this year. And then they have, Brown and Smith. But it's like, I don't even think I know who the definitive... is their third wide receiver Julio? I don't even think it is Julio. And if it is Julio, that just shows that, like, Julio didn't do hardly anything this year. He joined this team, I think, in the sense that he thought, oh, I'm going to be able to win a ring, possibly. But he's far from what he once was. And I don't want to say that he was only there to collect a paycheck, but I am damn happy that all these people that said, oh, we should sign Julio, he'll be a good veteran presence for our young wide receivers in Green Bay. And it's like, maybe he did help Brown, but I highly doubt it because Brown is great in his own right. And maybe he helps Smith, but it's like, how much is he going to be able to teach a guy who is a small wide receiver, the smallest we maybe have ever seen, who's great? When Julio's always been a 6'3", 230 guy. But, the Eagles losing, I'm not surprised. Tampa Bay putting up this many points, I feel like we know they're capable of that, and I really don't know what's going to happen with Philadelphia. Like I think that in a city like Philadelphia where their fans are so incredibly passionate, there's going to be a lot of noise for months, so who knows? It depends on what they decide to do. If they keep Sirianni, which I think that I wouldn't say they owe it to keep him, cuz but it's I think that he would only have one more season, and if they didn't like turn it around or at least get to like the divisional or the championship and look good, like this team, oh yeah, we can build, we can keep on building, or has this team like up pinnacled and it can only get worse, which I don't agree with. I just think that they have too much talent. But yeah, looking at the Buccaneers and the Eagles, Tampa Bay took advantage of a struggling team. And I think it says more about Philadelphia than it does the Buccaneers. And we'll see whether the Buccaneers can make it past the divisional round. Because they play the Lions. And don't get me wrong, I think that they can somewhat match up well against the Lions, but it's one of those things where who knows? I said we would probably preview the games for, next week. We obviously have 2 games on Saturday, 2 on Sunday. We have both number 1 seeds on Saturday. I think that that's another thing that maybe the league did, but to kind of incentivize to get the number 1 seed. Because that at least means, I guess, not really for Houston because they played last Saturday, so they get a week off. But my Packers obviously played Sunday, which I don't think the team really they didn't really get banged up except for Kingsley and Igbari. I guess I haven't checked, but the fear was that he had an ACL tear, and even if it's minor than that, I don't think he plays. But otherwise, there's really there really to me wasn't like any sort of super bad injuries this weekend. I mean, Anzalone on the Detroit kind of had a scare, but he came back. Um, looking to these next games, we have Houston visiting Baltimore, and I do think this is going to be where we either see, we kind of see where Stroud is at. I know I said that with the Cowboys, or I mean, no, the Browns. Why did I say the Cowboys? But now they're playing a fully rested Ravens team, that has had a bye. Obviously, the number 1 seed for good reason. Clearly, the best team going into the postseason. But I think, what we can expect from this game is it's going to be kind of a gritty. It's going to be kind of a gritty game where Baltimore might just have the edge just because of, not to say that Houston doesn't have a decent defense at this stage, but Lamar Jackson, there's a reason why he's, has the potential to win an MVP every year because of just how lethal he is on the ground as well as with his arm. So it's going to be a tough game for Houston more than likely, but I think it's going to be a fun game. I think that Stroud, has the mental to go up against a defense like that. And unless he has like a colossal collapse, which I just don't see. He's a very calm and, even tempered demeanor type of cornerback or quarterback. Blah. Going on to Green Bay and San Fran, I am of the opinion now that if Barry isn't calling this kind of prevent defense that he has, because obviously, in a lot of, I do want to say that it was kind of garbage time, when Dallas, because they obviously had 3 dudes over 100 yards, but they obviously had that when they were down by like 4 scores. And that's the kind of thing that it's like, I don't think in any scenario that the Cowboys come back from that. But I think that my Packers are going to put up quite a game against San Fran. unless Barry reverts to how he coached and played defense against like the likes of the Giants, Baker Mayfield, maybe. I mean, I feel like that team is pretty talented offensively, even though they haven't shown it all year. And then even Bryce Young, like I mean, it just was like, oh man, maybe LaFleur lit a fire under him after that because he's like, this is the number one overall pick, but this is an offense that hasn't performed all year and done that well. But I here's my kind of take on it. I think that because, my Packers played very well against what was one of the, what people said was one of the best pass rushes in the league, where you have Zach Tom performing extremely well. And it's like, I thought that he would play well and give up like limited pressures and potential sacks, but I had no expectation that he would do a shutout kind of game where Parsons, oh yeah, you're not getting by me, dude. And I think that, Micah Parsons, Nick Bosa, Myles Garrett, they all fall under that game wrecker category. And if you've got a guy who's a security blanket like Tom, I think that you have the potential to be able to pass against them. And I think that it's going to be a scrappy game. I think that Purdy also has had times where he has given games away. The Niners had that rough stretch, which ultimately was the reason why they were kind of like, oh, we can't close the year. I mean, we did have kind of a guaranteed by the final week type of thing, but they weren't able to. They were on pace to being able to rest their guys potentially with a couple games left, but because of some suspect games and a kind of a rough patch where Purdy was throwing some interceptions, I think that could be the difference because as you guys have seen, Love hasn't been turning the ball over. I think the one pick he's had, and I think it's the last 9 games now. Gosh, I'm trying to remember what it was, but I think that it was one of those where it's like he had nothing to lose and he just put it up or something like that. So with that, I think the difference in this game could be whether Purdy, you get pressure on Purdy and he makes, bad interceptions. I do know that the Niners offense is scary as hell. I am a little bit scared because I think that obviously, CeeDee Lamb and Dak looked unstoppable and everyone was like, "Oh, CeeDee's going to have like over 150 yards," type of thing, but you look at if one guy on the team of the Niners has a down game, they still have like 3 other weapons. Like let's say Debo has a small game. Oh, look, we have Ayuk, McCaffrey, and Kittle doing well. Or Ayuk, he didn't do anything the whole game. But yeah, Debo scorched us for all of these yards. And then I also think about, how San Fran, gosh, the last time I saw him, you saw Kittle kind of, blazing it up. And I'm like, yeah, no, dude, I don't want to see this guy wrecking us. But I think that they're a lot tougher and more legitimate of a team than the Cowboys are, but I'd like to think it's still anybody's game, with the momentum that my Packers have. And I think that this team is just hungry. My Packers give me the vibes that we're not cocky, which is, I think that that's one of those unsung things that if you are a team that doesn't get cocky, you're just stone cold and you're going to keep on doing what you've been doing all year. But, I think I mean, it's probably not surprising to say that that's going to be the most exciting game of the weekend. Then we have on Sunday, we have Tampa Bay and Detroit. Probably the biggest doozy of the game where both these teams were in. I mean, Tampa Bay obviously wasn't in a closer game, but they were playing one of obviously the weaker playoff teams, which, I don't like going by record. I like going with what the momentum is going into the offseason. And I mean, Tampa Bay, we'll see if they're able to really compete against Detroit. I think that Detroit, with their style of play, they don't necessarily need to run it a lot against Vita Vea, but I think that they're going to be able to do a lot more. In Tampa Bay, it could become a shootout in a sense. You know, unless Detroit's secondary really doesn't play scrappy. But if it's anything of what we saw, where they are constantly getting beaten, they're committing these what should be penalties, Evans and Godwin could have a day where it's like, oh yeah, the Detroit could shoot themselves in the foot with penalties potentially. Moving on to Sunday night, we have Kansas City and Buffalo, a matchup that we are all way too familiar with, where Buffalo, you know, is the second seed and they are at home. So, you know, if Kansas City goes up there, these teams both played obviously in, you know, crappy elements. So I don't think that's going to be too much of an advantage for either team. And it's like, I mean, maybe Kansas City, it's even better. Like, I think that it was colder at their game with the wind chill. I mean, the wind, good Lord, I would not want to play in that. This seems like a miserable day, but, you know, less miserable because you get a win. But who's to know what's going to happen in this game? Excuse me. I think that with the way Buffalo is in their gritty defense and the way that Josh Allen is, I think that he could maybe exploit Kansas City a little bit. I think that the Bills also are probably sick of living in Kansas City's shadow because they've usually lost to them. And, you know, tempers are going to be flared for, you know, both teams. And don't get me wrong, I think the passing game was better, surprisingly, for Kansas City last week. But they were up against a Dolphins secondary that hasn't lived close to expectation. And Buffalo with their gritty defense, I want to lean towards Buffalo actually for this game. I think that, you know, Kansas City, with the tough year that they've had, this is kind of the game where it's like, you've got to prove you belong in the playoffs. This is the prove it game. People could have said that about the Dolphins, but I just didn't really see it because the Dolphins, they've had a shoddy defense all year. Yeah, they've had some blowout games where it's like, oh yeah, it doesn't even look close. But their defense hasn't been very good in that many close games against good teams. So that's why I think that, you know, Kansas City's the underdog. And I think that Buffalo, I think if you go out there and show you can be more physical, you can show that Kansas City, it's going to be a tough road for them. Otherwise, that's kind of my quick take on, you know, the games for, that's kind of my quick take for the games on for next week in the divisional round. And if there are any of you that aren't chatting, you know, you could tell me your kind of opinions or ask me, you know, any sort of questions you may have. If nobody has any more questions, though, I would like to thank you guys for watching this edition of Castcast. And, you know, we'll see you on Friday. And as always, go Pack Go.